It was late, far later than Max usually stayed out on a typical Friday night. But something about tonight felt different. The streets of the city were empty, save for the occasional car passing by, the hum of the engine cutting through the stillness. Max, dressed in his worn leather jacket and riding his motorcycle, felt that familiar rush of adrenaline as he zipped through the winding alleyways, the roar of the engine reverberating in his chest. The thrill of the ride was enough to drown out the noise of his mind, the memories of a life he didn't like to think about. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night was his. It always was. And tonight, the city felt like it was his, too. Max loved this. Being out here, far from the watchful eyes of his parents and the rules that weighed him down in the rest of his life. He could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. His motorcycle was the only thing that made him feel free. As he sped down a narrow street, he saw something moving in the shadows up ahead. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog or maybe a group of kids messing around. But as he got closer, he realized it was something else. A cat. It was just sitting there, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at him as if it had no fear. Maybe it had been left behind by some careless owner. Max slowed his bike, intrigued for a moment. His fingers twitched on the throttle. He didn't know why, but there was something about that cat that made him want to do something, anything, to get a rise out of it. He pulled to a stop and kicked the stand down with a thud, the noise echoing through the alley. The cat didn't move. Max stared at it for a moment, studying its wide, innocent eyes. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of a kind of dark amusement. He hadn't planned to hurt the cat. It was just a stray, right? But something about it, sitting there so calmly, irritated him. The calmness, the stillness. He hated it. Before he could even think twice, he kicked out his boot. The cat yowled in pain as it was sent tumbling across the cold asphalt, its small body landing with a thud that made Max's lips curl into a grin. He laughed. "Stupid cat," he muttered under his breath. He hadn't even given it a second thought when he revved his engine, kicked up the stand, and sped off into the night, leaving the cat lying motionless behind him. What a rush. The whole thing felt exhilarating. Max didn't know who the cat belonged to. He didn't care. It was just a stupid animal. But what he didn't realize as he tore down the road, the wind whipping his hair back, was that the cat he had just kicked belonged to someone very important. Someone whose life was about to be turned upside down because of one careless, thoughtless act. Meanwhile, in a mansion on the outskirts of town, Barron Trump was sitting in his room, his favorite cat curled up at his feet. It had been a long day, and Barron was looking forward to the quiet solace of his room. He had always preferred being alone, away from the constant buzz of the media, away from the noise of the world. His cat, a fluffy gray Persian with a soft, comforting purr, was his only companion when he needed peace. Barron had grown up in the shadow of his family's fame, but he never cared about any of it. He liked his life simple. His cat was his world, and he loved her more than anyone knew. But tonight was different. He noticed that his cat wasn't acting like herself. She was pacing nervously around his room, stopping every so often to look out the window, as if something was wrong. Barron furrowed his brow. His cat wasn't one to be so skittish. He bent down to pet her, but she recoiled, as if she'd been startled by something. "Hey, what's going on?" he whispered to her, though he knew she couldn't answer. He didn't understand. His cat had always been a calm and affectionate creature, but tonight, she seemed off. The feeling grew stronger as the minutes passed. Barron stood up, pacing in his room, checking the windows and doorways, trying to calm the strange feeling growing inside him. Something wasn't right. His cat's behavior, this sense of unease, was all too familiar. Something had happened. He grabbed his phone and dialed his mom's number. No answer. He tried his dad. Nothing. Barron sat back down on his bed, his mind racing. His cat's strange behavior wouldn't leave him alone. Something was wrong. It wasn't like her to act this way. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from his best friend, Lucas. "Barron, something's happened to your cat. She's been hurt. I think she's been kicked." Barron's heart dropped. Back in the alley, the cat lay motionless, the damage done. It wasn't just a small scratch or bruise. The cat's body was badly injured, its movements slow and weak as it tried to drag itself to a safe spot. Max hadn't realized the extent of the pain he had caused. As Barron's worry mounted, he scrambled to his feet. "No, no, no," he whispered under his breath. His worst fears had come true. The cat, his cat, was hurt. Barron's fingers clenched the edge of his desk as he stared at the message, his heart pounding. He didn't know who would do such a thing, but one thing was certain. Whoever had hurt his cat would pay. He wouldn't let it slide. This wasn't just any cat. This was Barron Trump's cat. And Max, reckless and unaware, had just made an enemy out of someone he could never have imagined. As Barron made the call to his parents, the beginnings of a new conflict started to unfold. A conflict that would not only affect their lives, but their entire worlds. Max was used to being alone. It was nothing new to him. From a young age, he'd learned that the world wasn't interested in helping you, and if you wanted something, you had to take it. His life had never been a story of happy endings or easy paths. The kind of people who made a difference in the world, or so he'd been told, were always the ones who had everything handed to them. People like Barron Trump, who came from money and influence, who had an easy life, free from struggle. Max? He had no such luxury. He wasn't born into a wealthy family. His mother was long gone, and his father had never been around much. He'd been bounced between foster homes, left to figure things out on his own. By the time he was old enough to ride a bike, he'd already made peace with the fact that nobody cared about him. So, he made his own rules, and breaking them felt like the only thing that made him feel alive. He dropped out of high school at 16. There were too many rules, too many people telling him how he should live his life. And since he was done with that, he did what he wanted, when he wanted. If the cops showed up, he'd just ride faster. If someone told him no, he'd find a way around it. That's what he liked most about being on his bike. The freedom, the wind in his face, the feeling of power. The bike was an extension of him, wild, untamed, and absolutely uncontrollable. But despite how much he loved the ride, there was always that nagging feeling, deep down, that he wasn't really going anywhere. Sure, he was fast and strong, but he wasn't happy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled, really smiled, from deep inside. There were just days when it felt like all he could do was ride and wait for something, anything, to change. Tonight, Max had met a girl at a bar. That was how it always went. Meet someone, talk a little, maybe grab a drink. Maybe things would get interesting. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, that gnawing emptiness was always there, lurking beneath the surface. His life was a series of fleeting moments, quick highs followed by the inevitable lows. Max had never been a cat person. He didn't have anything against them, but they weren't his thing. Dogs? Sure. He liked the way they wagged their tails when they saw him. But cats? Too independent. Too proud. They didn't care about you, and that was fine. Max didn't need anyone to care about him. That's why the cat in the alley had irritated him so much. It sat there, perfectly still, as if daring him to do something. As if it knew something he didn't. But why had he kicked it? He couldn't say. It had been instinct. A rush of power. The sound of its body hitting the ground. The way it yowled in pain. It had felt good. Not in a moral sense. Not in a this is the right thing to do sense, but in a visceral way. In a way that made him feel like he was in control for once. But now, as he sat in his room, reflecting on it, the excitement was fading. The adrenaline was gone, replaced with a slight discomfort in his stomach, the kind that lingered after a bad decision. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd done was wrong, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. He didn't feel like going out again. The high from the bike had worn off. Instead, he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, lit a cigarette, and sank into the couch. That's when his phone buzzed. He frowned, not recognizing the number. Hello? Max? This is Lucas. Listen, man, I've got bad news. You better sit down. Max's brow furrowed. What's up? It's the cat. The one you kicked. I know you didn't mean to, but it's hurt bad. Barron Trump's cat. They're looking for whoever did it. And man, you might want to lay low. Max's blood ran cold. Barron Trump. The name hit him like a cold slap to the face. He'd heard of Barron, of course. Everyone had. The kid from the famous family. Quiet, private, and rich beyond belief. Max never paid much attention to him. He didn't care about people like that. People who had everything. People who lived lives that Max could never dream of. But Barron's cat? The one he had kicked in the alley? Max stood up, pacing now, his heart beating faster with every word Lucas spoke. You're kidding. Barron Trump's cat? I wish I was, Lucas said, his voice tense. They're looking for the guy who did it. And if they find out it was you? Max didn't need Lucas to finish the sentence. He knew what it meant. He was in trouble now. Big trouble. Not just for hurting an innocent animal, but because this time, the person on the other side of the equation wasn't some random street kid. This was Barron Trump, someone whose family had the means to make his life a living hell. Max wasn't scared of much, but he wasn't stupid either. He knew that pissing off a kid like Barron Trump could end badly. What should I do? Max asked, though deep down, he already knew the answer. Lay low, Lucas replied. Don't let anyone know where you are for a while. And, don't do anything else that might make it worse. Max hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had a reputation. He wasn't just some nobody. He had friends, people who respected him, feared him even. He was tough, untouchable. But Barron Trump? He had power, connections, a family that could buy anything they wanted. Max felt a knot form in his stomach. It was one thing to mess with someone like him. It was another thing to mess with someone who had the kind of resources that could make his life a nightmare. And now, the cat he'd kicked, the cat he hadn't even thought twice about, was going to bring all of that crashing down on him. Max wasn't used to feeling this way. He was used to controlling the narrative, calling the shots. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. He needed to get out of town. Barron Trump sat in the grand library of his family's estate, his attention focused not on the leather-bound books that lined the shelves, but on the soft, rhythmic purring of his cat, who had finally calmed down in his lap. His cat, Snow, was a gray Persian with fur as soft as clouds and eyes that always seemed to be filled with quiet wisdom. Barron had grown up with Snow since he was a child, and there was something about the cat's calm presence that had always made him feel more at ease, especially in the midst of the chaotic world he was born into. Barron's life was unlike most people's. His family name was famous, but not in the way he would have liked. People didn't just know who he was, they watched him. His father, Donald Trump, was a billionaire real estate magnate who had captured the nation's attention long before Barron was born. His mother, Melania, had been a supermodel before becoming First Lady. The world, whether Barron liked it or not, had always been interested in his family. But Barron had never been interested in fame. He wasn't like his siblings, Donald Jr., Ivanka, or Eric. They thrived in the spotlight, running their father's empire and often appearing in public for photo ops or business meetings. Barron, on the other hand, had always preferred solitude, spending his time at home, away from the flash of cameras and the noise of social media. His refuge was his room, where he could read, play games, and enjoy the quiet companionship of Snow, who had been with him through thick and thin. Tonight, however, the peace was shattered by an unexpected message that sent a ripple of anxiety through his chest. Barron's phone buzzed on the marble coffee table in front of him. It was from Lucas, his best friend, a quiet kid from his private school who had known Barron since they were both very young. The two of them had always been close. Lucas, like Barron, preferred to stay out of the spotlight, away from the prying eyes of the world. Barron picked up the phone, glancing at the message with a sinking feeling. Barron, I've got some bad news. Snow's hurt. Badly. I think someone kicked her in the alley behind the house. Barron's hands went cold as his eyes scanned the words over and over. His cat, his companion, his friend, was hurt. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He had a hard time believing it at first. Snow had been acting strange earlier, pacing around the room and meowing at the window, but he never expected something like this. He thought maybe she was just a little off tonight, but now it all made sense. Barron stood up so quickly that Snow jumped off his lap and onto the floor. His heart raced as panic began to set in. His mind raced. Who would do such a thing? Why? And how could someone hurt a defenseless animal, especially one so precious to him? He immediately dialed his parents' numbers. His mother was the first to pick up. "Barron, darling, is everything okay?" "Mom, Snow's hurt. Someone kicked her, badly. I need to find out who did this." Melania's voice immediately shifted from calm to concerned. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry. Are you all right? Do you need me to come home?" "No, I'm fine, but I need to do something about this. I can't just let this slide." Barron's mind was filled with one thought. Who did this to her? His fingers trembled as he ended the call and began searching through his messages. There was no way he could let this go. His parents might be busy with their work, but this was personal. This was his family. Snow had been there for him since childhood. She had comforted him when no one else did. Barron couldn't just sit back and pretend that nothing happened. Max had no idea what he was getting into when he kicked that cat. Sure, he'd known it was someone's pet, but he never imagined it would be Barron Trump's cat. In fact, the thought of Barron even existing in his world hadn't crossed his mind at all. The Trump family lived on the other side of the city, in a part of town that Max rarely went to. The two worlds couldn't have been further apart. Max didn't care about the rich. He didn't care about their money or their power. But Barron was different. Unlike his father or his siblings, Barron had always been more reclusive, more reserved. He wasn't in the media spotlight much, which, to Max, made him an easy target. But now, Max was learning that Barron Trump wasn't just any rich kid. He had connections, resources, things that Max couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, Max had made an enemy of him without even realizing it. Barron, still reeling from the news, was already making plans. He couldn't just let this go. He had to find the person responsible. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. His cat had been hurt, and he wouldn't let whoever had done this get away with it. He got up and paced around his room, his mind racing. He needed answers. But how? How could he even begin to track down the person who had done this? He dialed Lucas's number again. "Lucas," Barron said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Do you know who did this? Do you have any idea who kicked Snow?" Lucas was silent for a moment. "I'm not sure. I know it was some guy on a motorcycle. I saw him leave the alley, but I couldn't get a good look at him." "I'm sorry, Barron." Barron clenched his fists, the frustration building inside him. A guy on a motorcycle? It could have been anyone. He had no idea where to even start looking. He was about to hang up when Lucas added, "I think I know someone who might help. I'll reach out and let you know what I find." "Thanks, Lucas. I appreciate it." Barron set the phone down with a sigh, his mind still spinning. He needed to take action. He couldn't just let it go. But what would he do if he found the guy who hurt Snow? Would he confront him? What would he say? Barron didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to rest until the person responsible for hurting his cat was brought to justice. Max, on the other hand, was already feeling the weight of his actions. He had no idea how much trouble he was in, but he wasn't one to back down from anything. Never had been. He figured he could deal with whatever came his way. After all, he'd always been able to talk his way out of trouble before. But this time, something felt different. He hadn't just hurt some random animal. He'd hurt someone who had the power to make his life a lot harder than it already was. The realization was starting to hit him. The game had just changed. Max wasn't used to being afraid. Fear was something for people who didn't have control, who let life dictate their actions. And Max? He always made his own path. But tonight, as the weight of his actions settled in, something inside him shifted. It wasn't the fear of getting caught by the cops or a random stranger. It was the realization that he had messed with someone far bigger than he could ever imagine. Barron Trump wasn't just some rich kid who lived in a mansion on the outskirts of town. He wasn't just another face in the media. Max had made a mistake, a stupid, reckless mistake. He had hurt the one thing Barron loved most, the one thing that had likely kept him grounded in a world that was always watching, always judging. His cat, Snow. And now Barron would stop at nothing to find out who had done it. Max had no idea how Barron was going to react, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be pretty. People with money and power didn't let things like this slide. But even though Max could feel the tension building in his chest, he wasn't going to run. That wasn't his style. He had made his bed, and now he'd lie in it. He wasn't going to let Barron Trump scare him into hiding. Barron sat at his desk, staring at the picture of Snow he had taken years ago. Her innocent, playful eyes stared back at him from the photo frame. It was a reminder of everything he'd lost in the last few hours. The hurt was still fresh, but what troubled him even more was the knowledge that someone out there was responsible. Someone had hurt his cat, and he was going to make them pay. The world Barron lived in was one where money and connections made the rules. His family's empire, built on wealth and influence, had given Barron access to things most people couldn't even fathom. And now, those resources were going to work for him. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Jeff, it's Barron," he said when the line picked up. "I need your help with something." Jeff was one of the private investigators Barron's family occasionally worked with for personal matters. His reputation was built on discretion and efficiency, qualities Barron knew would come in handy tonight. "I need to find out who hurt my cat. Someone kicked her in an alley, and I want to know who did it." Barron felt his pulse quicken as the words left his mouth. There was a part of him that knew Jeff would get answers fast, but another part of him felt unsettled. He wasn't used to dealing with problems in this way. He didn't want to chase down some stranger over a damn cat. But this felt personal. The response from Jeff was quick and reassuring. "I'll have my team look into it. We'll track down the person who did this for you, Barron. We won't rest until we get results." Barron hung up, his mind already racing. He knew this wasn't going to end quietly. No matter how much money his family had, no matter how many resources they could throw at this, Max, the person who had done this, would be facing the wrath of a world far beyond his comprehension. The Trump family wasn't used to losing, and Barron was determined that this wouldn't be the first time. Max sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers drumming nervously against the edge of his phone. He had already been through the worst of it, the rush of adrenaline, the regret, and now the waiting. His mind spun with possibilities. What could Barron do? Would he come after him directly? Or would he send someone after him? As far as Max knew, Barron was just another rich kid who never had to fight for anything. What could someone like him possibly do to someone like Max? The more he thought about it, the more absurd the idea seemed. Barron Trump couldn't touch him. Not really. Max had dealt with bigger problems before. He wasn't some soft kid who needed protection. But the uneasy feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He could hear it in Lucas's voice earlier. There was something serious happening behind the scenes. Barron Trump wasn't going to let this go. Not when someone had hurt his cat. Max stood up and grabbed his jacket. It wasn't even midnight yet, but he needed to clear his head. Grabbing his keys, he headed for the door. His motorcycle sat in the driveway, ready to take him on another ride. Away from his thoughts, away from everything that was starting to feel like it was spiraling out of control. But as he pulled out of the driveway and onto the road, the weight of his actions settled on his shoulders. Barron's cat was probably still hurting, and Max didn't know how to fix that. By the time Barron's team of investigators had gotten started, they were already making progress. It didn't take long for them to dig up information on Max. There wasn't much about him, which made him easier to track. A kid from a troubled background. A few minor run-ins with the law. A loner. No real ties to anyone important. But Barron's investigators didn't need much. They started pulling up records, security camera footage from the alleyway near the incident, eyewitness accounts from locals who had seen the motorcycle speeding off that night. They even managed to get a partial plate number from a nearby gas station security camera. And that's when Barron's investigators found the smoking gun. Max's full name was Max Parker. The investigators had found his address, his social media profiles, every detail they needed. They knew where he lived, what he did, and who he hung out with. The entire city had opened up to them in minutes. Barron, sitting in his family's study, stared at the results in disbelief. There was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that they were closing in on Max, but it was mixed with an overwhelming anger. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure Max understood that there were consequences for his actions. Max didn't realize how close he was to being found. He was halfway through his ride, racing through the quiet streets, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas. "Max, you need to get out of town. They're already looking for you." Barron Trump's people, they're serious. I heard they have private investigators after you. This isn't just some angry kid. His family's got resources. Max's blood ran cold. He knew that the moment Barron found out who he was, things would escalate. But he never imagined Barron would go to this extreme. Max looked around at the quiet street, the neon lights reflecting in puddles of rain on the pavement. He had to leave now. As Max gunned the throttle and sped down the road, Barron sat in his study, staring at the screen. He could feel it. The final showdown was approaching. Max couldn't breathe. The world outside his helmet was nothing but a blur. Streets, buildings, streetlights, all rushing past in a chaotic storm of color and sound. His mind was racing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt real fear. It wasn't just the cops. It wasn't even the threat of some random angry person. No, this time, it was different. Barron Trump wasn't just any kid. He wasn't some rich, spoiled brat who could just throw money at problems. Barron had the means, the resources, and most importantly, the determination to make things right. Max could feel the heat of the chase on his heels. He didn't know how, but somehow, Barron's team had figured out who he was. They tracked him down, found out where he lived, and now they were coming for him. Private investigators. People who had access to more than just public records. These were professionals. Max had made a powerful enemy, and there was no running from it now. The rain had started coming down harder, the droplets pelting his face, making it even harder to see. But Max didn't care. He needed to get out of town. He didn't know where he was going or how long he could keep this up, but he couldn't stay. He couldn't risk Barron finding him. He pushed the bike harder, weaving between cars and dodging the puddles that had turned the streets into treacherous rivers. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see headlights in the distance. He didn't know how they were tracking him, but he knew Barron's people would stop at nothing to catch him. Barron sat in the back of a sleek, black SUV, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. The screen on the dashboard displayed real-time data from his investigators, Max's last known location, the route he was taking, and even the sound of his motorcycle's engine recorded from a nearby camera. Everything was connected. Everything was being tracked. Barron had never imagined that something like this would happen. It had started out as an emotional reaction, anger, frustration, the need for justice after Snow was hurt. But now it was more than that. This wasn't just about protecting his cat. This was about sending a message. People like Max couldn't just go around causing harm and expect there to be no consequences. "Are we close?" Barron asked, his voice sharp, directed at the man sitting in the front seat. The driver, Jeff's associate, nodded. "We have him in our sights. He's heading west, toward the highway. We should be able to catch up in about 10 minutes. Barron's heart pounded in his chest. It was crazy, this feeling. He was used to being calm, in control. But now, with every passing second, the thrill of the chase consumed him. He wanted to find Max. He wanted to confront him, to make him understand what it felt like to mess with someone who had everything at their disposal. He didn't care about the law or morality. All he cared about was making sure this didn't happen again. Max felt like he was running out of time. He knew they were close, and every instinct told him to keep going, keep riding, keep pushing farther and farther away. But his bike was starting to sputter. He could feel it. The engine was misfiring. The throttle wasn't as responsive as it should be. Great. Just what he needed. Max glanced at the fuel gauge. Half empty. That was enough to make him curse under his breath. He had to find a gas station, fast. There was no way he was going to outrun them if his bike broke down. He made a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to lose whoever was tailing him. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the streets slick and dangerous. Max didn't care. His mind was focused solely on getting away. But as he rounded another corner, he caught a glimpse of headlights in the distance. It was impossible to miss them, bright, glaring, getting closer by the second. "They're here," Max muttered to himself. He felt his pulse quicken, a surge of panic clawing at his throat. He pushed the bike harder, squeezing the throttle and leaning into the turns. The engine roared, cutting through the rain as he sped down the road. But the headlights were still there, relentless, closing in. Barron's SUV was right behind him now. They had him cornered. The city streets were narrow, wet, and filled with obstacles. Max couldn't keep up this pace for much longer, and Barron wasn't going to stop until he got answers. Barron leaned forward, his eyes glued to the screen as the map updated with Max's position. They were almost there. One more block. "We've got him," Jeff's associate said, his voice steady but tinged with excitement. "He's not going to escape this time." Barron didn't respond. He wasn't interested in the chase anymore. He just wanted it to end. He wanted Max to stop running, to face him, to acknowledge the gravity of what he had done. His mind flashed back to Snow, her pain, her confused eyes as she looked up at him, and how helpless he had felt in that moment. He wasn't going to let Max get away with it. Not after everything Snow had meant to him. Max's bike was running on fumes. He could see the end of the block approaching, but he knew there was nowhere to hide. The street was a dead end. He'd made a mistake, one he couldn't take back. His heart was hammering in his chest as he prepared for the inevitable. He braked hard, skidding to a stop just as he reached the end of the street. The rain was coming down in torrents now, and he could feel his clothes getting soaked through as he jumped off the bike. He turned to face the street, his back to the brick wall of an alley, trapped with nowhere to run. Barron's SUV slid to a stop just a few yards away, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The door opened, and Barron stepped out, his posture stiff, his face set in an expression of calm determination. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was just focused. Max didn't move. He couldn't. His heart was still racing, but there was no escape now. Barron had him. Barron walked slowly toward him, his eyes never leaving Max. The rain soaked his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. Max could feel the weight of Barron's gaze as if it were a physical force pressing down on him. "You hurt my cat," Barron said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an underlying edge to it. "And now, I'm going to make sure you understand what happens when you mess with my family." Max swallowed hard. He didn't know what Barron would do. He didn't know how far this would go. But whatever happened next, Max knew one thing. His life was never going to be the same again. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and the world felt like it had shrunk to the few feet between Max and Barron. Time seemed to slow as Max stood there, frozen, his heart pounding against his ribcage. Barron Trump, the son of one of the most powerful men in the world, was standing in front of him, his eyes filled with an intensity that Max had never seen before. This wasn't just some rich kid throwing around his weight. No, Barron was serious, and Max had no idea what to expect. Max tried to steady his breathing, but the adrenaline was making it harder. His motorcycle sat behind him, the engine still ticking as it cooled. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the sound of the rain pounding on the pavement and the soft rumble of the SUV, still idling a few feet away. Barron's gaze was sharp, his expression calm but unsettling. "You thought you could just hurt my cat and get away with it?" Max opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say. He had messed up. He knew that. But he hadn't meant for things to get so out of hand. It had started as a stupid prank, a dumb moment of anger, kicking the cat, watching it run off, laughing with his friends. He never imagined it would spiral into something like this. "I didn't think it'd matter, okay?" Max finally blurted out, his voice hoarse. "It was just a cat. I didn't." "A cat?" Barron interrupted, his voice growing more intense. "You think Snow is just a cat? She's been with me since I was a little kid. She's part of my family, part of me." Max winced at Barron's words. He could feel the weight of them in his chest, the realization that this was no longer just about a dumb mistake. The look in Barron's eyes told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't something Barron could just forgive. He wasn't going to let it go. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Max stammered, his hands trembling. "I didn't think it would be a big deal. It was just a joke." "A joke?" Barron's voice was cold now, his jaw clenched. "You kicked her like she was nothing. Do you know how much she means to me? To my family?" Max shook his head, trying to make sense of everything. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know it was your cat. If I had—" Barron stepped forward, cutting him off. His face was just inches away from Max's now, and Max could feel the force of Barron's presence. "Now you know, and you're going to make it right." Max opened his mouth to protest, But Barron held up a hand, silencing him. Don't. You hurt her. You need to understand the consequences of your actions. Max took a step back, his mind spinning. This wasn't a conversation about justice anymore. It was about power. Barron had power. He had influence. And Max was just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, caught up in something way bigger than he ever intended. I didn't mean to mess with you, man, Max muttered, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I'm sorry. Really? Barron didn't flinch. He didn't seem moved by Max's apology. Sorry doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the hurt you caused. It doesn't fix Snow. Max swallowed hard. What do you want me to do? Barron paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, it felt like the rain had stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath as Barron considered Max's words. I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, Barron finally said, his voice even but hard. I want you to see what it's like to be on the other side of this. I want you to see how it feels when someone you care about gets hurt. Max's heart raced. He couldn't imagine what Barron was going to say next. Was this it? Was Barron going to have him arrested? Take him to court? Make an example of him? But Barron surprised him. I'm going to give you a choice, Barron said, his voice steady. You can make things right. You can own up to what you did, apologize to my family, and we'll call it even. Or, Barron paused, and the silence between them felt like a hammer in Max's chest. Or I can make sure the whole world knows what you did. I'll make sure every single person knows how you hurt my cat. I'll put your name on the news, on social media. You'll be nothing but a joke to everyone. Max's stomach dropped. Barron's words hit harder than any punch could. Max knew what it felt like to be on the outside, to be the kid who never fit in, the one who was always the target. And the thought of becoming the punchline to Barron's story, the one thing that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was worse than anything he could imagine. Choose, Barron said, his voice quiet, almost too calm. Max's mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was his moment. He could keep running, keep fighting, or he could face the consequences of his actions and try to make it right. But making it right felt impossible. Barron had power, and Max had nothing but regret. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the pouring rain, neither of them speaking. The city around them felt like a distant echo. Max could barely breathe under the weight of Barron's stare. Finally, Max exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't ruin my life. Barron studied him for a long moment. Max felt like he was being sized up, judged. And for the first time, he felt small, completely powerless. Good, Barron said, his voice finally softening, just slightly. That's the right choice. Now, you're going to go to my house tomorrow. You'll look my parents in the eye and apologize. No excuses. No more lying. You'll tell them everything. Max nodded, his throat dry. I will. I swear. Barron nodded, turning away. That's what I thought. But just as Barron was about to leave, he stopped. He looked back at Max, his expression serious once more. And if you ever think about doing something like this again, Barron said, his voice low and cold, I won't be so forgiving next time. Understand? Max swallowed, his heart hammering again. I understand. Barron didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked back to the SUV, the sound of the rain masking his footsteps. Max stood there in the rain, feeling the cold seep into his bones, his mind racing with the consequences of everything that had just happened. He had been given a second chance, but how long would it last? As Barron's SUV pulled away, Max stood alone on the dark street, the rain now falling harder than ever. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was for sure. His life would never be the same. The next day felt like a slow-motion blur. Max hardly slept, and when he did, the nightmares were worse than ever. Flashes of Barron's cold eyes, the sound of the rain, the relentless feeling of being cornered. He couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The apology, the choice, the price he would have to pay for his mistake. Max spent the morning pacing in his tiny, dimly lit apartment, barely eating, barely thinking. All he could focus on was the fact that, at some point today, he would be standing in front of Barron Trump's family, apologizing for what he'd done to their precious cat. He couldn't even explain why he had kicked Snow in the first place. It was a cruel joke, one that had felt harmless at the time. But it was anything but harmless now. He had hurt someone who mattered to Barron, a family member, a creature that was as important to him as anything in this world. Max knew he didn't deserve forgiveness. He couldn't take back what he had done. But maybe, just maybe, he could show Barron that he wasn't the monster Barron had painted him to be. After all, people made mistakes, didn't they? When the time came, Max stood outside the gates of Barron Trump's estate, his palms sweating as he stared up at the large, imposing house. He had never been in a place like this. The mansion loomed before him, its windows reflecting the dull gray sky above. It was a fortress of wealth, a place where he'd always imagined the richest people in the world lived, far removed from the reality of his own life. He swallowed hard and stepped forward, his footsteps echoing on the driveway as he approached the front door. A security guard met him at the entrance, his expression unreadable, his uniform sharp and professional. Max felt the sting of his own ragged clothing, the worn jeans and old jacket that couldn't be further from the crisp, expensive suits Barron's family probably wore. "Mr. Parker," the guard said, his tone cold but polite. "Follow me." Max nodded, swallowing his nerves. He didn't know if he should be angry, scared, or both. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he couldn't back down now. The guard led him through the grand hallway of the mansion. Max couldn't help but stare at the luxurious surroundings. Marble floors, gilded frames, expensive artwork hanging on every wall. Everything in the house screamed money, things that Max had never even dreamed of. It felt like a world apart from his own. Finally, they stopped in front of a large, ornate door. The guard knocked once, then pushed it open, motioning for Max to enter. Max took a deep breath and stepped inside. Barron was sitting at a polished wooden desk in the center of the room, a large window behind him revealing the sprawling estate beyond. His parents were seated in chairs across from him. His mother, Melania, looked serene and composed, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit. His father, Donald Trump, was looking over some papers, his demeanor as powerful as always. Max froze, his throat tightening. This was real. He had to face them now. Barron didn't move as Max entered. He didn't even look up, just kept his eyes trained on the papers in front of him. Max felt an odd sense of dread fill him. "Sit," Donald Trump said, his voice deep and authoritative. He gestured toward the chair in front of Barron's desk. Max hesitated for only a moment before sitting down, his heart pounding in his chest. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if the room had frozen, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. Max could feel Barron's gaze on him, but it wasn't the same intense stare from the night before. It was cold now, dispassionate. Finally, Barron spoke, his voice calm but edged with something Max couldn't quite place. "You've come to apologize, Max." Max nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, I'm sorry. For what I did to Snow." There was an awkward silence. Max's eyes darted between Barron, his parents, and the cat bed in the corner of the room where Snow was curled up, contentedly asleep. Max swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. He felt smaller in this room, insignificant. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Max continued, his voice shaking just slightly. "I didn't know she was your cat. I didn't know she meant that much to you, to your family. But I still should have known better. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Barron remained silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice softer but still firm. "Apologies don't fix what happened. They don't take back the pain you caused." He paused, as though considering his next words. "But I'm listening." Max felt a flicker of hope. At least Barron wasn't completely shutting him out. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Max said quickly, almost desperate, "but I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll donate to a shelter. I'll volunteer. I'll whatever you want. I'll do it." Barron looked up at him then, his expression unreadable. "I don't want your money, Max, or your charity. I want you to understand the weight of your actions." Max nodded again. He did understand, in a way. He understood that kicking a defenseless animal wasn't a joke. It wasn't something that could be brushed off. But how could he ever truly understand what it felt like to be Barron? To have someone you loved hurt and not know how to fix it? "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Max said quietly. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Barron leaned back in his chair, his eyes still on Max. For a moment, the room was heavy with silence again. Donald Trump finally spoke, his voice low but commanding. "Barron, it's your decision what happens next. But I think we can all agree that people, no matter who they are, should face the consequences of their actions. And it seems like Max here is trying to do that." Melania, who had been quietly observing, added softly, "It takes courage to apologize, especially when it's hard. But actions matter more than words, young man." Max nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief at the words from Barron's mother. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as he had imagined. Maybe there was still a chance for him to move forward without ruining his life entirely. "Here's what's going to happen," Barron said, breaking the silence. "You're going to spend a day at the animal shelter. Not for the PR. Not for anyone else. For you. So you can understand what it means to care for an animal, to truly be responsible for their well-being. And then you'll come back here, look me in the eye, and tell me what you've learned. If you do that, I'll consider this over." Max blinked, surprised. "That's it?" Barron shrugged. "We all make mistakes, but you have to take responsibility for them." Max felt the weight of Barron's words settle into him. This wasn't a free pass, but it was something. It was a chance to make things right. "I'll do it," Max said quietly, standing up. "Thank you." Barron didn't respond, but his eyes softened ever so slightly as he turned to his parents. "Good," Donald Trump said with a nod. "It's time for you to show that you can do better." Max took one last look at Barron before turning to leave the room. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in days, he felt like he might have a shot at redemption. Max barely slept again that night. The weight of what had happened, of Barron's ultimatum, lingered in his chest like an anchor. He had never been one to back down, but this was different. This wasn't some bad decision he could chalk up to being young and reckless. This was real. His actions had consequences, and he was finally facing them. He awoke early the next morning, the sunlight streaming through his thin curtains and casting a golden glow over the small room. He didn't have time to waste. Today was the day he had to prove he wasn't just some careless jerk. He was going to make things right, starting with Snow. The animal shelter Barron had sent him to was a modest building on the edge of town, far from the wealth and opulence Max had seen at Barron's estate. It was a no-frills place, with concrete floors, simple metal cages, and a smell that made Max wrinkle his nose. But as soon as he walked in, he felt the weight of what he had agreed to. An older woman, her hair pulled into a tight bun and her face etched with years of experience, greeted him with a raised eyebrow. "You're here because of a cat, huh?" Max swallowed, unsure how to respond to the bluntness in her voice. "Yeah, I made a mistake, and I need to make it right." She nodded, her expression softening just a bit. "You're not the first one who's come in here thinking an apology is enough. But this is real work, kid. This isn't about saying sorry and walking away." Max nodded, taking a deep breath. He wasn't here to be lectured. He was here to learn. The woman, whose name turned out to be Carol, led him to a small, open area at the back of the shelter, where a few volunteers were walking dogs and cleaning cages. A couple of cats were lounging in the corner, their eyes lazily following the movement around them. "All right," Carol said, pointing to a mop and bucket. "Start by cleaning out the cages. Animals don't care about apologies. They care about their environment. They care about the people who feed them, clean up after them, and give them attention." Max nodded and grabbed the mop, setting to work. He cleaned cage after cage, scrubbing down the floors, washing away the grime, and wiping down the bars with meticulous care. The work was grueling and uncomfortable, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting it right. He worked for hours. At first, it felt like he was moving through mud, the silence heavy and oppressive. But after a while, something shifted. He began to notice the little things. The way the cats perked up when he refilled their food bowls, how they seemed to relax when he gently patted them on the head. It wasn't just about cleaning. It was about care. It was about responsibility. As the day went on, Carol watched him, her gaze steady but not unkind. She didn't say much, but Max could tell she was assessing him, waiting to see if he would give up, if he would stop short of the work. But he didn't. He kept going, sweat dripping from his brow, his muscles sore from the labor. At some point, Carol came up beside him. "You're doing all right," she said, her voice gruff but approving. "But don't think it's about you now. It's about them." She gestured toward the animals in the shelter. "You'll see. If you stick around long enough, you'll understand." Max didn't respond at first. He was too focused on the task at hand. But Carol's words sank in, making him realize something he hadn't thought about before. The animals weren't here because they wanted to be. They were here because someone had failed them. And that failure had a ripple effect. By the time the sun began to set, Max had finished cleaning most of the cages. His back ached, his hands were raw, but there was a sense of accomplishment he had never felt before. Carol came over and stood beside him, watching him as he finished cleaning the last cage. "You've learned something today," she said, her tone softer than before. Max wiped his brow and nodded. "I think I have." She smiled, a rare thing. "It's not about fixing what's been broken in one day, Max. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Max stood there for a long moment, staring at the cages filled with animals that had been abandoned, hurt, or left behind. He didn't know if he would ever truly be able to make it up to Snow, but he knew that what he was doing now, what he had started today, was part of that journey. When Max returned to Barron's house the next morning, he felt different. He had spent the evening reflecting on what had happened, on the lesson Carol had taught him. The work at the shelter had been grueling, but it had opened his eyes in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't just cleaning cages. He was cleaning his own conscience, piece by piece. As he walked up to the front door, his nerves returned. This wasn't over. This wasn't just an apology, it was a reckoning. The same security guard from yesterday greeted him at the door. "You're back," he said with a raised eyebrow. Max nodded. "Yeah, I'm here to talk to Barron." The guard didn't say anything else, just led him to the same room where he had faced Barron's parents the day before. This time, Barron was already sitting at the desk, but this time, his posture was a little less stiff. Max could see the faintest hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Have a seat," Barron said, gesturing to the same chair Max had occupied before. Max sat down, his palms sweaty. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready to face the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. "I did what you asked," Max said, his voice steady but with a slight tremor. "I spent the day at the shelter, cleaning cages, feeding the animals. I know it's not enough, but I want you to know that I get it now. I understand what I did was wrong. It wasn't just a cat. It was something you care about." Barron didn't immediately respond. His gaze focused on Max. Max couldn't tell what Barron was thinking, but the silence between them was heavy. Finally, Barron spoke. "You learned something, huh?" Max nodded. "Yeah, I did. It's not just about saying sorry. It's about doing something about it. I understand that now." Barron studied him for a moment longer, then sighed. "All right, I'll take your word for it. You've got the chance to fix things, Max. But it's up to you to make sure you don't mess it up again." Max exhaled slowly, the tension easing in his chest just a little. He wasn't off the hook, not by a long shot. But this was a step in the right direction. He had made it through the first test. Now, all he had to do was keep proving that he could be better. Max couldn't shake the feeling that his work at the shelter was just the beginning. Barron's words had stuck with him, echoing in his mind like a drumbeat. "It's up to you to make sure you don't mess it up again." It was simple, almost too simple. But Max knew he had to prove himself, not just to Barron, not just to Snow, but to himself. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, the weight of the next step in his journey weighed heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't just show up to the shelter once and think he was done. That would be a joke. No, this was about real change, about proving he could be better, not just in one moment, but in every moment. The next day, Max returned to the shelter. He'd barely thought twice about it. He woke up early, grabbed a cup of coffee, and headed straight there. Carol had given him a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. When he arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers were coming and going, feeding animals, cleaning cages, and answering calls. Carol was there, as expected, looking more or less the same as the day before. Serious, no nonsense. "Back already, huh?" she said with a slight, knowing smile. "Got a lot of work to do. There's always something in here that needs attention. You ready to get to it?" Max nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, I'm ready." "Good," Carol said, pointing him to a stack of towels and cleaning supplies. "Start with the dog pins. They've been a mess all week." Max immediately got to work, cleaning and scrubbing without stopping. The smell of disinfectant and the sounds of the dogs barking in the background filled the air. He worked methodically, trying not to think too much, focusing instead on the simple task at hand. There was something therapeutic about it, something that made the world feel less overwhelming. As the day went on, Max noticed something that hadn't registered the day before. The animals were different. They were creatures with their own needs, their own desires. The cats, especially Snow, who was back at the shelter after a couple of days of rest at Barron's house, watched him intently, but they weren't just watching him for food. It was as if they were trying to understand what kind of person he was. Max found himself thinking about Snow more than he expected. He'd kicked her, and that was the part that would haunt him. But seeing her now, curled up in a blanket, purring softly when he knelt to feed her, he realized just how much trust it took for an animal to forgive, and how much harder it would be for him to earn that trust back. Carol saw him staring at Snow. "You think she's forgotten what you did?" she asked, her voice almost philosophical. Max hesitated. "I don't know." "You're lucky she's not holding a grudge," Carol said with a smirk. "Animals don't always hold on to anger the way people do, but they remember the things that affect them. And you've got a long way to go before you earn her trust again." Max nodded. The words stung more than he cared to admit, but they were true. He didn't deserve to be absolved just because he showed up to clean some cages. He needed to prove himself in ways that mattered more than anything he'd done before. That afternoon, Max had a break between cleaning shifts. He sat outside, his mind drifting. He kept thinking back to Barron's house, to that cold moment when Barron had told him it was up to him to make things right. At first, it had felt like a punishment, but now, with every hour he spent at the shelter, with every interaction he had with the animals, it felt like a responsibility, a chance to learn something deeper than he ever thought he could. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his old friend, Ethan. "Ethan, yo, heard you're working at a shelter now? What happened to the Max I knew?" Max stared at the text, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't spoken to Ethan in a while, not since the incident with Snow had blown up. Ethan had been the one who egged him on that night, joking about how fun it would be to mess with a cat. The whole thing had felt like a joke to Ethan, but it hadn't been a joke to Barron, or to Snow, or to Max. Max typed back a response. "Max, things changed. It wasn't right. I'm trying to make it better." "Ethan, make it better? Dude, chill. It's just a cat." Max's fingers hovered over the keys. His old life, his old friends, felt so distant now. How could Ethan understand? How could anyone? But then, before he could reply, another message came through, this time from an unknown number. "Unknown. This is Barron. I want to see you at my house tomorrow. You've done what I asked. Now it's time for the next step." Max's heart skipped a beat. The next step? He set the phone down, his mind racing. He had no idea what Barron had in store, but whatever it was serious. Max knew he was still under scrutiny. His time at the shelter had been important, but Barron wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. Max stood up, dusting the dirt off his jeans. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the shelter grounds. He was ready for whatever came next. He had done the work. He had learned the lessons. Now, he had to face Barron again, this time with the full weight of what he had done, what he had become, hanging over him. The next morning, Max didn't waste any time. He grabbed a shower, dressed quickly, and headed out to Barron's estate again. His heart was pounding, his thoughts a blur. He wasn't sure what Barron wanted now, but he knew this was his final test. When he arrived, the same security guard greeted him with a nod, leading him up the steps to the front door. The house was quieter today, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Barron was waiting for him in the same room where they'd spoken before. But this time, something felt different. There was an air of finality in Barron's expression, an expectation that Max couldn't quite place. "Sit," Barron said, gesturing to the chair. This time, though, his voice wasn't as cold. There was something in it, an acknowledgement maybe, that Max had earned his right to be there. Max took a seat, his hands slightly clammy. Barron didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I told you this would be a process," he began. "You've done your part at the shelter. But now, you need to show me you understand the responsibility that comes with caring for a living thing." Max nodded, unsure where this was going. He hadn't expected Barron to be so formal about it. "You're going to be Snow's caretaker for a week," Barron continued. "You'll be responsible for feeding her, walking her, making sure she's comfortable. You'll report back to me daily. If you can handle that responsibility, we'll consider this matter closed." Max's eyes widened. "Caretaker for a week? This is your final test," Barron added. "Prove to me you understand what it means to care for someone else. Not just animals, people too. And if you screw it up, then we're done." Max nodded, the weight of the decision sinking in. This was his chance to truly make things right, to show Barron, to show Snow, to show himself that he was capable of change. "All right," Max said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Barron leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "We'll see." Max could hardly believe what Barron had just said. Caretaker for a week. It felt like an opportunity and a test all wrapped into one. Snow, the cat he had once harmed for no reason other than boredom, was now his responsibility. It was surreal, almost like a punishment he had to endure for his actions, but deep down, Max understood it was also a chance for redemption. He left Barron's estate that morning, his mind racing with thoughts of the next 7 days. He had already messed up once. He wasn't about to let that happen again. But how could he prove he was capable of handling Snow's care? What did Barron expect from him? What did Snow need? The more he thought about it, the more the pressure mounted. This wasn't just about keeping a pet alive. It was about showing Barron that he had learned the most important lesson of all, responsibility. And it was about showing himself that he was worthy of trust. That afternoon, Max picked up Snow from Barron's house. She was quieter than usual, her usual playful nature dulled by the experience of being around someone who had hurt her. She looked up at him with her big, green eyes as he carried her into his car. Max gently placed her in the passenger seat, buckling her in as if she were a child. The drive home was long, and the silence between them felt strange. Max wasn't sure what Snow thought of him now, but he was determined to show her he was serious about making things right. When they arrived at his apartment, Snow seemed hesitant as she stepped out of the car. Max set her down on the ground, watching her move cautiously toward the door. She sniffed the air, took a few tentative steps, and then looked up at him with a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. He followed her inside, setting up a cozy little area for her in the living room. A soft bed, a food bowl, and a few toys. Max didn't know if she'd use any of it, but he figured it was a good start. He'd learned a lot in the past few days at the shelter, but it wasn't just about feeding her. It was about understanding her needs and making her feel safe. The first night was rough. Snow hid under the couch most of the time, only coming out when she was hungry. Max sat by her, trying to coax her out with soft words and gentle gestures. But Snow wasn't having it. She wasn't ready to trust him again, and that was something Max had to come to terms with. The next few days were a blur of feeding, cleaning, and waiting. Max spent hours trying to bond with Snow, though she often seemed indifferent to him. He fed her, cleaned her litter box, and made sure she had fresh water every day. But there were moments when she would glance at him, and Max would see a flicker of recognition, almost as if she were silently reminding him of the past. One morning, Max tried something different. He sat down with Snow, her food bowl in his lap, and simply stared at her. No words, no actions, just quiet presence. He wasn't sure why he thought it would work, but it felt right. Snow slowly crept out from under the couch, her nose twitching at the scent of the food. She sat down cautiously, eyeing him as if weighing whether or not he could be trusted. Max held his breath, unsure of what to do next. But he didn't need to do anything. Snow eventually relaxed, her body language softening. She ate her food, a few feet away from him, her eyes still glancing up occasionally, as if to check if he would do something wrong. Max didn't move. He just sat there, letting her take the lead. Over the next couple of days, things started to change. Snow began to spend more time out of hiding, sitting near Max when he was watching TV, curling up at his feet while he worked. It was slow, painfully slow, but he could feel the shift. He wasn't just taking care of her anymore. He was earning her trust. And then, it happened. One evening, as Max sat on the couch, Snow jumped onto the armrest next to him. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes wide and curious. Max barely breathed, afraid to move. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Snow rubbed her face against his hand. It was the first sign of affection he'd gotten from her, and it was everything. Max's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. "You're not so bad, huh?" Max whispered to her, his voice thick with emotion. Snow didn't respond, but she stayed close, resting her head against his arm as he continued to pet her gently. That night, Max couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind turning over the events of the last few days. He had been working hard, learning what it meant to take responsibility, but he also realized something else. The process wasn't just about earning Snow's trust. It was about him earning his own trust. The work at the shelter, the care he was giving Snow now, wasn't just about fixing the damage he'd done. It was about making sure he never hurt anyone like that again. On the 5th day, Max got a message from Barron. It was short and to the point. "Barron, how's it going with Snow?" Max didn't hesitate. He'd been waiting for this moment, the moment Barron would check in on his progress. "Max, it's been good. I think she's starting to trust me again. It's slow, but I'm doing everything I can to make it right." There was a long pause before Barron replied. "Barron, you're doing better than I expected. But remember, this isn't just about Snow. It's about you learning to be the person you're meant to be. Don't let her down." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Max read the message over a few times, letting the words sink in. Barron wasn't just checking on Snow. He was checking on him. Barron was watching him, not just as someone who'd done something wrong, but as someone who had the potential to grow. Max had known from the beginning that Barron wasn't going to make this easy. But he was starting to see something else, too. He was seeing a chance for change, a chance to prove that he was capable of being better. That evening, Max took Snow outside for the first time. He'd been waiting for the right moment, and it felt like the right time. He carefully clipped the leash onto her harness, watching as she sniffed the air, her body tense. They walked around the small yard, Snow pulling at the leash, but Max didn't force her. He let her explore at her own pace. The evening was cool, the sky turning a soft pink as the sun began to set. Snow's steps were tentative at first, but after a few minutes, she started to relax. She walked alongside him, sniffing the grass, her tail flicking with interest. Max couldn't help but smile. He had done it. He had taken care of her. And slowly, Snow was starting to see him as something more than just the guy who had hurt her. As the week drew to a close, Max knew he wasn't quite done yet. The work, the responsibility, it didn't end after just a few days. But something had shifted in him. He had learned to care, to slow down, to think before he acted. He had learned what it meant to be truly responsible. The final test was coming. Barron would be checking in again soon, and Max knew that whatever came next would depend on how well he had truly understood what it meant to change. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, Max was ready. The week had flown by in a blur of responsibility, moments of tenderness with Snow, and an unspoken pressure to prove himself. Max had spent his days walking Snow, feeding her, and simply being present in ways he hadn't thought possible before. Every time he looked at her, he saw the quiet transformation, the trust she was starting to offer, despite the wrong he had done her. But there was something else that had changed in Max, too. He was beginning to understand what Barron had meant. It wasn't just about showing up and doing the bare minimum. It was about giving everything you had, even when no one was watching. It was about being someone worth trusting, not just for the animals you took care of, but for everyone around you. Max wasn't just doing this for Snow. He was doing it for himself. As the week drew to a close, Max found himself feeling more and more nervous. Barron hadn't checked in since that message a few days ago. The silence was deafening. It was as if Barron was waiting for the perfect moment to see if Max had truly learned the lessons he was meant to learn. Max had prepared himself for the worst. He didn't expect Barron to just let him off the hook. He had a feeling that this final test wasn't going to be easy, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had no idea what Barron's expectations really were. The day Barron was supposed to check in finally arrived. Max had just finished cleaning Snow's litter box when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Barron. "Barron, I'm coming by in 1 hour. Be ready." Max's heart skipped a beat. 1 hour. That was it. He had no idea what Barron was planning, but he knew it was time to face whatever was next. He quickly tidied up his apartment, making sure everything was in order. The space was modest, but it was clean, and for once, it felt like it was his. Something he had worked to maintain, something he could take pride in. Snow was lounging on the couch, watching him with a curious gaze. Max gave her a soft smile, brushing a hand over her fur. "You ready for this?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. He wasn't sure if he was ready, either. When Barron arrived, Max opened the door with a nervous smile. Barron walked in, his eyes scanning the apartment for any signs of disarray or neglect. Max could feel the weight of his gaze as Barron examined the space, looking past the surface and into the life Max had built in the past week. It wasn't much, but it was something. Barron's eyes eventually landed on Snow, who was now perched on the armrest of the couch, staring at him with an almost regal expression. Max held his breath, waiting for Barron's reaction. "Well, she looks healthier," Barron said, his voice calm but not without a trace of approval. "I can tell you've been taking care of her. That's a good start." Max felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it didn't last long. Barron's face remained unreadable. "Tell me," Barron continued, his tone shifting slightly, "what do you think you've learned from this week?" Max took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what Barron was expecting, but this was his chance to prove himself. "I've learned that it's not just about taking care of an animal," Max said, his voice steady. "It's about being responsible for something bigger than yourself. About earning trust, not just through words, but through actions. And that sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but it's always worth it." Barron's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Max. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. Max couldn't read Barron's expression, but he could feel the intensity in the room. "You're right," Barron said slowly, nodding. "But it's more than that. Responsibility isn't just about what you do for others. It's about what you do when no one is looking. It's about holding yourself accountable, even when it's inconvenient. You've been given a second chance, Max. But the real question is, will you keep proving yourself, even after this?" Max nodded, his stomach twisting with uncertainty. "I will. I'll keep proving it. I know I can do better." Barron didn't say anything for a moment. He simply watched Max, as if trying to decide whether he truly believed him. Finally, Barron spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," Barron said. "You've shown me that you're capable of change, but now, you need to prove it consistently. You're not just going to be responsible for Snow. You're going to be responsible for your own future. Every decision, every action, it matters. And I want you to remember that." Max swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Barron's words. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. "Thank you," Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron gave him a curt nod, then turned toward Snow. "She's been a good test for you," he said, his tone changing slightly. "But you're not finished yet. Keep proving yourself. And if you ever forget why you're doing this, just remember, you're doing it because you want to be a better person." Max nodded again, more determined than ever. He had come so far, but he knew Barron was right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. After Barron left, Max stood there for a long time, processing everything that had just happened. The words Barron had said, the weight of his expectations, it was a lot to take in. But Max knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to mess this up again. He wasn't going to let himself, or anyone else, down. Snow jumped off the couch and walked over to him, nuzzling his leg. Max reached down to pet her, the bond between them now stronger than ever. He had learned how to care for her. But more importantly, he had learned how to care for himself. As he sat down on the couch, Snow curled up beside him, and Max realized that he was no longer the person who had kicked her for fun. He was someone who could be trusted, someone who was capable of love and care. He had passed the test, but the real challenge was just beginning. The days following Barron's visit were a whirlwind of reflection and adjustment. Max had proven himself in Barron's eyes, but deep down, he knew the road to true redemption wasn't paved with a single week of responsibility. It wasn't even about how well he'd cared for Snow during that time. It was about consistency, about continuing to show up, even when the world around him didn't demand it. Snow had begun to trust him more. She followed him around the apartment now, sometimes even jumping up onto the couch beside him without hesitation. The affection was still tentative, a slow burn rather than an all-at-once explosion of love. But it was progress, and Max felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Not just for Snow, but for himself. But despite the small victories, Max felt like he was still being watched. He wasn't sure if it was Barron's words ringing in his ears, or if it was just the weight of his own self-doubt, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still on trial. This wasn't just about Snow anymore. It was about everything: his future, his integrity, his ability to stand tall even when the road got rocky. It was on the 10th day after Barron's visit that Max received a text from him. "Barron, I'll be sending someone to check on Snow tomorrow. I want to make sure everything is going well. Be ready." Max read the message twice. His first reaction was panic, but it quickly morphed into determination. The tests never stopped, did they? Barron was keeping him on his toes. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but he couldn't deny that the pressure of it all was starting to wear on him. But Max had promised Barron, and more importantly, he'd promised himself. He was going to keep proving he was capable. He wasn't just going to care for Snow because Barron was watching. He was going to care for her because she deserved it, and because he finally understood the weight of his own actions. That night, he made sure everything was in perfect order. He cleaned Snow's litter box, prepared her food for the morning, and made sure her favorite toys were nearby. It was a ritual now, one that had become second nature. He even set up a little play area for her in the living room, thinking it might be a good way to show the person Barron was sending that he was taking his responsibilities seriously. The next day, just as Max was finishing breakfast, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find a young woman standing there with a clipboard in hand. She wore a professional-looking uniform, and there was something about her demeanor that suggested she wasn't here for a friendly visit. "Max Harlan?" she asked, glancing at her clipboard. "Yeah, that's me," Max said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You must be the person Barron sent." She nodded curtly. "I'm Rachel. Barron asked me to check on Snow. Is she here?" Max stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. "She's in the living room," he said, leading the way. Snow, who had been lounging on the couch, stood up as they entered the room. She looked at Rachel, her posture stiff as if she could sense that this was no ordinary visit. Rachel immediately walked over to Snow, her eyes scanning the cat with clinical precision. "How's she been acting?" she asked, not looking at Max as she leaned down to observe Snow's behavior. Max swallowed, feeling the weight of the question. He'd been taking care of Snow for over a week now, but the reality of being evaluated again hit him hard. He wasn't sure what Barron had told Rachel, but he had a feeling it was more than just a casual checkup. "She's been adjusting," Max said. "She's a little shy still, but she's eating, playing, and resting more comfortably than when I first took her in." Rachel nodded as she continued to examine Snow, noting her responses to different stimuli. Max noticed the way she scrutinized every little detail, how Snow reacted when she touched her ears, the way she flinched when Rachel moved too quickly. It wasn't a casual observation. It was a full assessment. After a few minutes, Rachel straightened up and looked at Max. "She seems to be doing well physically," she said, but her tone didn't give anything away. "But how are you doing with her?" Max wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he knew the question was loaded. "I'm doing okay," Max said cautiously. "I'm learning how to care for her in the best way I can. I want to make sure I'm doing this right." Rachel studied him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that felt like a challenge, as though she were trying to determine if he truly understood what it meant to be responsible. It was uncomfortable, but Max held her gaze. "You know," she said, finally breaking the silence, "it's not just about feeding her and cleaning up after her. Taking care of a pet is about understanding their needs beyond the basics. It's about knowing when they need space, when they need affection, and when they just need someone to be there." Snow's been through a lot. It's not just the physical care that matters, it's the emotional care. Max nodded, his heart tightening in his chest. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects, the feeding, the cleaning, the walking, that he hadn't thought much about Snow's emotional state. Rachel was right. He hadn't yet earned her trust fully. He had spent so much time worried about doing everything perfectly that he hadn't stopped to consider what Snow needed emotionally. Rachel looked at him, as though reading his thoughts. "You need to keep that in mind. Animals can be just as emotionally complex as humans. They won't open up until they feel safe." Max felt a pang of guilt. Snow had started to trust him in small ways, but he realized there was still so much more work to do. He wasn't done proving himself, not yet. "I'll work on that," Max said quietly, feeling the weight of her words. "I'll keep trying to understand her better." Rachel gave him a brief nod, as if satisfied with his response. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just make sure you stay consistent. Animals remember. Snow won't forget if you fall short, and neither will Barron." With that, Rachel stood up, gave Snow one last look, and turned to leave. "Barron will be in touch," she said before disappearing out the door. Max stood in the empty room, his mind racing. It wasn't enough to just care for Snow. He had to understand her, every part of her. Max had thought he was doing everything right, but Rachel's visit had made him realize how much more he needed to grow. Snow was still sitting on the couch, her green eyes watching him carefully. Max walked over slowly, sitting beside her. He reached out a hand, gently stroking her fur. Snow didn't flinch this time. She let him touch her, and for a moment, Max felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. But there was still more to do. The days following Rachel's visit felt like a quiet but unrelenting wake-up call. Max had spent so much time focusing on the logistics of taking care of Snow, feeding her, cleaning her litter box, and making sure her water bowl was full, that he'd overlooked something much more important: understanding her on an emotional level. He hadn't even fully realized that, despite the progress they'd made, there were still barriers between them. Barriers that weren't so easily broken. Max knew he had to change his approach. The work wasn't over. It was just beginning. And if he wanted to prove to Barron and to himself that he was capable of taking responsibility for more than just the physical care of an animal, he needed to get it right. The next morning, as Max was preparing Snow's breakfast, he reflected on everything he had learned so far. Snow had come a long way since that first night she came to live with him. At first, she was completely distrustful. She would hide for hours, barely acknowledging his presence. But now, she seemed to seek him out, curling up beside him on the couch during the evenings, even letting him stroke her fur without flinching. Still, there was something fragile about their relationship. Snow's trust was a delicate thing, earned through countless small actions. Max had to be careful not to break it with impatience, to remember that healing, whether physical or emotional, was a slow, steady process. But there was also something else, something he hadn't expected. Later that afternoon, Max found himself sitting at his desk, working on a freelance assignment. He'd been so busy with Snow and Barron's expectations that he'd let his work slide a bit. But now, as he focused on the task at hand, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this. The quiet rhythm of work, the mental space it gave him. Snow had taken a nap on her favorite perch by the window, the sunlight casting a soft glow on her fur. Max glanced over at her, the weight of the day starting to sink in. Despite everything, he felt proud of how far they'd come. He had taken on the responsibility of caring for her, and that responsibility had taught him lessons he never expected to learn. But was it enough? He glanced at his phone, noting that it had been a few days since he'd heard from Barron. Max wasn't sure if he was expecting a message, but the silence felt odd. It made him wonder if Barron was keeping a closer watch on him than he let on. The following evening, Just as Max was preparing dinner, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Barron. It was a text from an unknown number. Unknown. How's Snow doing? Is everything okay? Max's fingers froze over the screen as he read the message. The phone number was unfamiliar, but the message was familiar in tone. It was clear that whoever sent it was watching. He stared at the text for a long moment. Who else knew about Snow? Was this another test from Barron? Or was it someone else? Perhaps someone connected to Barron's network, monitoring his every move? Max quickly typed a reply. Max, Snow's doing well. I'm keeping up with her care and making sure she's comfortable. No problems so far. He hit send, but his anxiety didn't subside. Something about the situation felt off. Snow was just a cat, but to Barron, she represented something much more significant. If Max didn't get this right, the stakes were higher than he realized. The phone buzzed again, and Max's stomach tightened as he saw the reply. Unknown, good. But you need to do more than just keep up with her care. Remember what I said about trust. Snow needs more than just basic attention. She needs your commitment. Make sure you're doing more than the minimum. The message sent a chill down his spine. Who was this person? And how did they know about his struggles with Snow? Was Barron behind it? Or was someone else? Someone watching from the shadows, waiting for Max to slip up? Max felt the weight of the message hanging over him. The pressure to prove himself was unbearable, and it felt like it was coming from all sides. He wasn't just taking care of Snow for Barron anymore. He was proving to himself that he was capable of doing something difficult and meaningful. The next morning, Max woke up early to take Snow outside for her morning walk. The fresh air, still cool from the night, felt good against his skin. Snow trotted ahead of him, the leash taut in his hand. She had been so skittish at first, hesitant to venture too far from the apartment, but now she was more confident. She wandered around the yard, her nose twitching as she explored. Max leaned against the fence, watching her, when his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from Barron. Barron, I'll be stopping by later today. Just a quick check-in. Be ready. Max's stomach flipped. He hadn't expected Barron to show up so soon after Rachel's visit. Was he going to get another surprise test? He thought he had a few more days to settle into the routine, but apparently, Barron had other plans. Snow, oblivious to the tension in the air, continued to sniff the grass, blissfully unaware of the quiet storm brewing in Max's mind. Max took a deep breath. He had to keep it together. He had to prove that the last week wasn't a fluke. This was his chance to show Barron that he was serious about his commitment. When Barron arrived later that afternoon, Max was ready. At least, he thought he was. He opened the door to find Barron standing on the threshold, his eyes scanning the apartment with the usual intensity. This time, however, Max felt something different. Barron wasn't just looking at Snow. He was looking at him. You're doing well with Snow, Barron said, stepping inside. I see that she's made herself at home. Max nodded, trying to hide his nerves. Yeah, she's adjusting. It's been a good week. Barron raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. A good week? He walked over to Snow, who was lying lazily on the couch, her eyes half closed in contentment. Barron crouched down to her level, reaching out to stroke her fur. I'm glad to see she's doing well, but I'm not just concerned about her. Max stiffened, his pulse quickening. Not just concerned about her. Barron stood up, his eyes locking onto Max's. I'm concerned about you, too. You're learning how to take care of Snow, but what I need to see is how you take care of yourself in the process. How you handle the pressure, the responsibility. How you respond when things get difficult. Max's heart raced. Was Barron testing him again? Or was this something deeper? I'm learning, Max said, his voice steady but uncertain. I'm doing my best. Barron studied him for a long moment, and for a second, Max wasn't sure if Barron believed him. Then Barron gave a slow nod. Good, Barron said quietly. Keep doing your best. Because this isn't just about Snow. It's about you, too. And if you want to earn my trust, and keep it, you'll need to keep proving that you're capable of more than just doing the bare minimum. Max nodded. He understood now. It wasn't enough to just show up and take care of Snow. This wasn't about checking boxes. It was about showing Barron and himself that he could rise to the challenge, no matter how much it tested him. And that was something Max wasn't sure he was ready for. But he would be. The days after Barron's visit were a blur of tension and quiet reflection. Max had always thought of himself as someone capable of taking care of things, but as Barron's words echoed in his mind, he began to realize how shallow that belief really was. Barron wasn't just concerned with Snow's well-being. He was concerned with Max's ability to handle responsibility, any responsibility. And that, for some reason, felt heavier than anything Max had faced before. In the days that followed, Max threw himself into his work with Snow. He made sure to spend extra time with her, playing, feeding, and making sure she was comfortable. Yet, despite all his efforts, there was still that nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. Snow, for her part, was showing more affection. She allowed him to pet her more freely and had even curled up beside him on the couch a few times. But Max couldn't help but feel as though they were still walking on a tightrope. One misstep and everything could come crashing down. It was hard for him to shake the feeling that every move he made was being watched. Whether by Barron or someone else, he could never be sure. But one thing was for certain. The pressure to get it right, to be perfect, was overwhelming. Max was sitting at his desk one afternoon when the phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. His stomach sank, and for a moment, he hesitated before opening it. Every text from this person seemed to feel like an ultimatum, like they were watching him, waiting for him to fail. He swiped the screen open. Unknown. How are you managing, Max? Still keeping up with Snow? I've been hearing things about you. Keep up the good work, but don't get too comfortable. Max's heart raced as he read the message. He felt the same creeping anxiety he had felt when Rachel had visited. This wasn't just a routine check-in. This person was actively keeping tabs on him, and it felt like they were waiting for him to slip. He typed a quick reply, his fingers trembling slightly. Max, Snow is fine. I'm managing. She's comfortable and seems happy. His finger hovered over the send button for a second longer, but something made him stop. He knew this was just another test, an unspoken one, and that what really mattered wasn't what he said, but how he proved it. Instead of waiting for a reply, Max set the phone down and stood up. He needed a break from this. He needed to clear his head. Max grabbed Snow's leash and clipped it onto her collar, deciding to take her for a walk. The fresh air always seemed to give him a bit of clarity, and maybe a short walk around the block would help him shake off the feeling of being under constant surveillance. He needed to feel like he had control over something, anything, again. Snow trotted beside him as they made their way down the sidewalk. The neighborhood was peaceful, with the sun beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the street. Snow seemed to be enjoying herself, sniffing the bushes and batting at the occasional fallen leaf. It was moments like these, quiet, simple, unpressured, that Max realized he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't doing this for Barron, or for the unknown texter. He was doing it for Snow, for himself. She was the one who needed him, not the faceless figures who seemed to be constantly watching him. As they made their way down the block, Max's thoughts wandered back to Barron. It was clear that Barron was trying to teach him something, but Max was beginning to feel like he was failing the lessons. He had made progress with Snow. She was no longer hiding from him, and she seemed to enjoy his company more. But was that enough? Was it really enough? By the time Max returned from the walk, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Snow had curled up on the couch again, her eyes half closed as she drifted into an afternoon nap. Max was about to settle in himself when his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Barron. Barron, I need you to meet me tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. No excuses. Max's chest tightened. What now? He had thought Barron was satisfied with the progress he'd made with Snow. But this text, this demand, sounded more urgent than anything Barron had said before. Was this another test? Or was this the moment when Barron would finally reveal whether Max had truly earned his trust? Max wasn't sure what was coming, but he knew he had no choice but to face it. The next morning, Max found himself standing outside a small coffee shop, waiting for Barron. It was early, too early for him to fully process what was happening. He kept glancing down at his phone, waiting for Barron's arrival, but Barron was punctual as always, appearing exactly at 9 a.m., as if he had been there all along. Barron didn't waste any time. He walked up to Max with his usual intensity, offering a quick, no-nonsense handshake before they both sat down at a table by the window. "You've been doing well," Barron said, after a brief silence. His voice was neutral, but Max could hear a note of something, approval, beneath the surface. "But I've been watching you, not just with Snow, but with yourself. And I need to know if you're ready for what comes next." Max's stomach flipped at the words. What came next? Barron wasn't making it clear, and Max wasn't sure if that was intentional or just a test in itself. "I'm ready," Max said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I've been doing my best. I'm learning. I'm taking care of her." Barron didn't respond immediately. He studied Max for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Max felt like Barron was reading every part of him, every doubt, every insecurity. Finally, Barron spoke again. "You've been keeping Snow, yes? But the real test is whether you're ready for a bigger responsibility." Max furrowed his brow. "A bigger responsibility?" Barron leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Yes. This isn't just about one animal, Max. This is about your capacity to take on responsibility for others. There's a bigger picture here, and it's time for you to understand it. Snow has taught you the basics, but you'll need more than just the basics if you're going to be part of something larger." Max didn't fully understand, but he could sense that this was a pivotal moment. Barron wasn't just talking about Snow anymore. He was talking about something deeper, something Max wasn't prepared for, but that he knew he needed to face. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," Max said again, this time more firmly. "I've come this far, and I'm not backing down now." Barron's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it, just calculation. "Good," Barron said, leaning back in his chair. "Because what comes next will test everything you thought you knew about yourself." Max swallowed hard. He didn't know what was coming, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Max spent the rest of the day replaying Barron's words in his mind. "What comes next will test everything you thought you knew about yourself." The weight of those words pressed on him all day, and as he returned to his apartment that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something big. He let himself into his apartment and set his bag down, all the while wondering what Barron had meant. Max had thought he'd proven himself, that he was on the right path with Snow. He'd spent so much time focusing on doing things right, but now he felt like Barron had opened a door to something far more complex and far more intimidating. Snow was lying on the couch when Max walked in, her green eyes watching him with a quiet intensity. It was as if she understood the pressure he was under. Max dropped down beside her, absent-mindedly scratching behind her ears. He had no idea what Barron had planned, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let himself fail. The next morning, Max was already up and dressed by 7 a.m., trying to mentally prepare himself for whatever Barron had in store. Snow had already been fed and given her morning cuddle time, and now Max was pacing in his living room, waiting. His phone buzzed at exactly 8:45 a.m. "Barron, meet me at the address I'm sending. Be there by 9. Max glanced at the address. It was a part of town he didn't recognize, a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city. His heart began to race. Where was Barron taking him? What was this about? He quickly grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. He had no choice but to follow Barron's orders. He'd come too far to back out now. The office building Barron had directed him to was nothing special on the outside. It had a dull, gray facade, with no distinguishing features except for a small sign by the door that read Altcorp Solutions. Max stood in front of it for a moment, his stomach flipping as he tried to make sense of what was going on. He had expected something more dramatic, maybe a large mansion or a lavish office, but this? It felt ordinary. Still, Barron had given him clear instructions. He couldn't back out now. Max pushed the door open, and a bell above the entrance jingled lightly. The inside was as plain as the outside. Stark white walls, a few low-profile chairs by the entrance, and a receptionist's desk with no one in sight. The room felt sterile, and the silence was almost oppressive. Max stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go or what to do, when a voice called out from the back. "Max, over here." Barron was standing in a doorway just beyond the reception area, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Max to come closer. Max's nerves tightened, but he did his best to appear calm as he walked over to Barron. "What is this place?" Max asked, trying to mask his uncertainty. Barron didn't answer right away. He turned and walked down a narrow hallway, gesturing for Max to follow him. "It's a place of business," Barron said simply, "but that's not what you need to know right now." Max's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as they walked deeper into the building. He glanced around, but there was no one else in sight, just Barron and the silence that stretched between them. Eventually, Barron stopped in front of a plain steel door and turned to face Max. "This is it. The next step?" His voice was low, serious. "You've been doing well with snow, but now I need to see what you're really capable of, what you're willing to do." Max swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness. Barron didn't answer right away. He simply opened the door, revealing a small room with a desk and a single chair. On the desk, there was a box. Nothing remarkable, just a plain cardboard box sitting there, waiting. But Max couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that came over him as soon as he saw it. "Take a seat," Barron said, his tone clipped. "You'll need to think carefully about what's in that box. You've already proven you can take care of snow, but this is something different. A test of judgment, a test of your ability to make tough decisions." Max stepped into the room, his pulse quickening. He glanced at the box on the desk. It looked harmless, but something about it felt ominous. He took a seat slowly, his eyes never leaving the box. Barron leaned against the doorframe, watching Max with a calculating look in his eyes. "You see, Max, trust isn't just about taking care of a pet. It's about understanding that sometimes the right choice is not the easy one. The right choice is about sacrifice, about doing what needs to be done, even when it's uncomfortable. You can't just do the bare minimum anymore." Max's chest tightened. He was beginning to understand, but he wasn't sure he liked it. "Open it," Barron instructed. Max hesitated for a moment, then reached forward and lifted the lid of the box. His breath caught as he looked inside. The box was filled with a collection of papers, nothing unusual at first glance. But as he sifted through them, a chill ran down his spine. Some were photographs, some were documents with names and addresses on them. The more he looked, the more he felt like something was off. There was a single note at the bottom of the box. Max pulled it out, unfolding the paper carefully. The words written on it were simple, but the weight of their meaning hit him like a ton of bricks. "Make the call. Max, someone's life depends on it. Will you make the sacrifice, or will you fail?" Max's hands shook as he held the note, his mind racing. What the hell was this? Barron's voice broke the silence. "These are real people, Max, real lives. You've got the power to change something here, save someone, or not. It's up to you." Max's head was spinning. He wasn't sure what Barron was asking, but he could sense the seriousness in his voice. This wasn't just some test to see if he could take care of a pet anymore. This was bigger than that. It was about moral choices, about the weight of decisions that would affect others in ways he couldn't yet understand. Max stood up, the box still clutched in his hands, his mind whirling. This was the moment, the test. And no matter what choice he made, there was no going back. "I need you to decide, Max," Barron's voice echoed in the room. "What kind of person are you really? Are you willing to sacrifice for the greater good? Or will you falter when faced with the truth?" Max's mind raced, his body frozen. He didn't know what was right anymore. But one thing was certain, Barron wasn't going to make it easy. And for the first time in a long time, Max wasn't sure what the right decision was. Max stood frozen in front of the desk, the box still clutched tightly in his hands. His heart raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, doubt, and fear. Someone's life depends on it. Will you make the sacrifice, or will you fail? The words on the note burned in his mind, each syllable like a hammer to his chest. He glanced at Barron, who stood in the doorway, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. There was no sympathy in his eyes, no hint of encouragement. Barron had dropped him into the fire, and now he had to decide whether to stand in the flames or walk away. Max's hands shook as he flipped through the photographs in the box. Each image seemed more damning than the last. Families, faces he didn't recognize, addresses he'd never been to. The papers, too, were full of names and phone numbers, all leading back to something. Something dark, something Max couldn't yet comprehend. "Who are these people?" Max asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Barron didn't immediately answer. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the small room. "You don't need to know who they are, Max. All you need to know is that they're out there, and now you have the power to influence what happens next. You make the choice. One call could change everything." Max's mind was a storm. He felt like a puppet, strings being pulled by forces he couldn't control. What was Barron's endgame here? Was this some kind of sick game? Was he supposed to save these people? Hurt them? And why the hell did Barron trust him with this? "I'm not a killer," Max said, more to himself than to Barron. Barron's face remained impassive, but there was a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "No one said anything about killing, Max. But this isn't about being a killer or not. It's about your ability to make a hard decision, a necessary one. Some people need to be taken down for the greater good. Some people need help, and it's up to you to decide who gets what." Max felt his breath catch. His mind raced. This was real. Barron was serious. Whatever this was, whatever these people were involved in, he was being asked to decide who lives and who suffers. He was being asked to play God. But how could he make a choice like that? Who was he to decide the fate of someone he didn't even know? Max felt the walls closing in on him. He thought back to Snow, to the reason he had come this far in the first place. He wasn't doing this for Barron, or for some mysterious game of power. He was doing it because Snow had taught him something. About care, about responsibility, about being there for someone who needed him. But this was different. "Why me?" Max finally asked, his voice breaking through the tension. "Why did you pick me for this?" Barron looked at him, as if the answer was obvious. "Because, Max, you're not the type to sit back and let things unfold. You've been tested before, and you've shown that you can make decisions under pressure. But now, we're pushing you further. If you can't make a choice now, then you're not the person I thought you were." Max's mind screamed. He wanted to throw the box away, run out of the room, forget this whole situation ever happened. But he knew that wasn't an option. He had come this far, and now he had to face whatever it was Barron had set in motion. Max's eyes skimmed the papers again. One of the documents caught his eye, a name he recognized. It was Rachel. Rachel, the woman who had brought Snow to him. The same woman who had warned him about Barron and the mysterious forces at play. The same woman who had hinted that there was much more going on than he had been led to believe. Max's heart skipped a beat. Was Rachel involved in this? Was she part of this twisted game Barron had set up? And if so, was she one of the people who needed saving? Or one of those he needed to take down? For the first time, Max felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just a test of responsibility. It was a test of morality, a test of what kind of person Max truly was. And Barron wasn't just playing a game with him. He was challenging him to decide whether he could live with the weight of that responsibility. Max took a deep breath and looked up at Barron. "What's the real play here, Barron? What do you want from me?" Barron's lips twisted into a smirk. "What I want, Max, is for you to understand that nothing in this world is as simple as it seems. You've been living in your bubble, thinking you could just follow a set of rules. Take care of Snow, do the right thing, live your life. But that's not how this works. Life is messy. People are messy. And now you get to decide how messy you're willing to get." Max stood up, his legs weak beneath him, his mind still reeling. Barron's words hung in the air, but he could feel his own thoughts beginning to crystallize. This wasn't about playing Barron's game. It was about taking control of his own fate. "I won't be your pawn," Max said, his voice steady but resolute. "I won't make a decision based on your manipulation. If you want something from me, you'll have to find another way." Barron's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. But Max held his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. Barron seemed to study him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked to the door, opened it, and turned back to Max. "You've made your choice then. I thought you'd be different." Max felt a wave of relief wash over him as Barron disappeared out the door. The weight of the box lifted, and he finally exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening. But that sense of relief was quickly replaced by a gnawing feeling in his gut. Had he made the right choice? Had he been strong enough? Or had he just walked away from something important? He sat down heavily, the room spinning around him. Snow's face flashed in his mind. He had done this for her, for the love and responsibility he had taken on when he chose to care for her. But was that enough? Was that the answer? Or was Barron right? Was the world more complex than he realized, full of choices with consequences that were beyond his understanding? Max didn't know, but for the first time, he realized he might never know the answers. Max spent the next few days in a haze. He went through the motions, feeding Snow, going to work, paying the bills, each task feeling more distant than the last. It was as if Barron's test had taken something from him, some piece of himself that he couldn't quite grasp. He kept replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The box, the note, the decision. Had he done the right thing? Had he been strong enough to resist Barron's manipulation? Or had he simply failed the test and let an opportunity slip away? The uncertainty gnawed at him like a constant hum in the back of his mind. Snow seemed to sense his unease. She followed him everywhere, her green eyes full of concern as if she understood that something was wrong. Max had always prided himself on being her protector, but now, for the first time, he felt like he needed protection himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that Barron was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. And what if Barron was right? What if he had been too naive to see that there were no easy answers, that the world wasn't as simple as he had once believed? The silence of the apartment was broken one evening when Max's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his stomach tightening when he saw the name. Barron, we need to talk. Max swallowed hard, staring at the message. He hadn't heard from Barron since their meeting at the office building. He hadn't been expecting anything. Certainly not this. What did Barron want now? And what kind of game was he playing this time? Before Max could overthink it, his phone buzzed again. Barron, come to the old warehouse on 5th and Willow. 10 p.m., don't be late. Max's heart raced. This was it. He couldn't ignore it. Barron had summoned him, and there was no backing out now. He stood up quickly, his mind set on one thing. He had to face whatever was coming head-on. Snow watched him closely, as if sensing the change in his demeanor, but Max didn't have time to explain. He grabbed his jacket, and without a second thought, he left the apartment. The warehouse loomed ahead as Max approached. It was an old, industrial building, its windows covered in grime, its brick exterior cracked and weathered. The air around it felt heavy, and the distant sound of traffic seemed muffled, as though the world outside was unaware of the dark energy that emanated from this place. Max hesitated for a moment, taking in the eerie silence. He didn't know what Barron had in mind, but his gut told him that this wasn't going to be a simple meeting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something dangerous, something that could change everything. He pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The warehouse was large and empty, the only sounds the echo of his footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Max, Barron's voice echoed through the space. Over here. Max turned toward the sound and saw Barron standing in the shadows, his figure barely visible except for the faint glow of a single overhead light. As Max approached, Barron stepped forward, his face still unreadable. Sit down, Barron said, gesturing to a metal chair placed in the center of the room. Max didn't hesitate this time. He sat, his eyes never leaving Barron. The tension in the air was palpable. There was something ominous about this meeting, something that felt like it was building to a breaking point. You've had time to think about your choice, Max, Barron said, his voice calm, almost too calm. And I can see that you're still questioning it. That's normal. But the truth is, you've already made your decision. Now you have to live with it. Max swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. What are you talking about? Barron stepped closer, his eyes cold and calculating. You think you walked away, Max. You think you made the right call. But I'm here to show you that every decision has a consequence. Max's heart pounded. What are you going to do? What's the consequence? Barron didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the floor in front of Max. Max stared at it for a long moment, the tension thickening. Open it, Barron ordered. Max reached down slowly, his hands shaking as he picked up the envelope. His mind raced, wondering what Barron had planned. Was this the moment everything would come crashing down? He tore open the envelope and pulled out a single photograph. His breath caught when he saw what it was. It was Rachel, the same Rachel who had brought snow to him. But in this photo, she wasn't smiling. She was tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear, a bloodied lip, and a look of terror on her face. The background was dark, but Max recognized it immediately, an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Max's pulse quickened, his vision blurring for a second as he tried to process what he was seeing. What the hell is this? This is the consequence of your inaction, Barron said coldly, his eyes never leaving Max. Because you couldn't make the hard choice when it counted, someone else has to pay the price. Max stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. What did you do to her? His voice was thick with anger and fear, but Barron's response was cold and unfeeling. Nothing yet, Barron said, his tone flat. But that's up to you now. You can make the call, Max. You can fix this. Or you can sit back and watch her pay for your weakness. Max felt a rush of panic surge through him. Rachel had trusted him. She had warned him about Barron. She had brought snow to him, and now, Barron was using her as leverage in some twisted game. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Barron was right about one thing. Every decision had a consequence. But was it too late to fix this? Was it too late to save Rachel? You can't do this, Max said, his voice shaky but firm. You can't just manipulate people like this. Barron didn't react. He simply stared at Max, his expression unreadable. I don't need to manipulate, Max. You've already made your choice. And now, you'll deal with the consequences. Max's mind spun, his thoughts racing in 1,000 directions. Was this really his fault? Had he been too naive, too unwilling to make the tough calls? Or was Barron playing him all along? For the first time, Max understood the true weight of the test Barron had set before him. This wasn't just about taking care of snow. It was about power, about control, and the willingness to do whatever it took to survive in a world where nothing was ever black and white. And now, the question remained. Would Max make the right call? Or would he be forced to watch someone else pay the price for his failure? Max paced the cold, concrete floor of the warehouse, his heart racing, his mind a whirlpool of chaos. Rachel's terrified face kept flashing in front of his eyes. The image burned into his mind. He couldn't unsee it. Her wide, pleading eyes, the bloodied lip, the helplessness that screamed louder than any words. This is your fault, Barron's voice echoed in his mind. You had the chance to make the right decision. Now, someone has to pay. Max's stomach twisted with guilt, but it wasn't just guilt that churned inside him. It was fear. Fear that he had no control over the situation. Fear that Barron had trapped him in a game with no way out. He stopped in his tracks and looked at Barron, still standing a few feet away, watching him with that cold, calculating gaze. Barron's eyes seemed to pierce through him, as though he was reading Max's every thought, every doubt. Barron wasn't just a man. He was a force, a shadow that loomed over everything, a manipulator who twisted the world to suit his needs. You can't keep doing this, Barron, Max said, his voice hoarse. His fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. You can't keep playing with people's lives like this. Rachel has nothing to do with this. Barron didn't flinch. His eyes never left Max. That's the problem, Max. You keep thinking you can separate yourself from this world. But you can't. You're in it now, whether you like it or not. Max felt a surge of frustration, a wild urge to lash out, but he controlled it, forcing himself to breathe. Think. He needed to think, to find a way out. Rachel's life hung in the balance, and Barron wasn't giving him any options. But maybe there was another way. Maybe. No, you're wrong, Max said, his voice suddenly steady. He looked Barron in the eye, his gaze hard. This is your game, but I won't play by your rules. Barron tilted his head, studying Max. There was a glimmer of something, maybe amusement, maybe approval, in his eyes. You think you can walk away from this unscathed? You think you can just ignore the consequences? Max swallowed. He had to make a choice, and there was no easy answer. He didn't know if Rachel was still alive. He didn't know who else Barron was involved with, or how deep this all went. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let Barron have the power over him anymore. For all the manipulations, the threats, and the power games, Barron was nothing more than a man. And Max wasn't going to let him control his future. "I don't care what you say," Max replied. "I'm not letting you win. I'm not playing your twisted little game." Barron's smirk faded slightly, but he didn't move, still standing in the shadows. "You're not the first person to defy me, Max. You won't be the last. But don't make the mistake of thinking there won't be a price." Max's pulse quickened. He didn't know what Barron had in mind, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going to be good. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let fear control him. Max took a step toward Barron, his voice firm. "I'm going to save Rachel, and if you're in my way, I'll make sure you regret it." Barron's expression darkened. "You think you can outplay me? You're not the one in charge here, Max. You never were." Max's eyes flickered to the photograph of Rachel in his hand. The fear in her eyes was real. "This is for her," he thought. "This is for Snow, for everyone who's ever trusted me. I'm not going to let Barron tear everything apart." With that, he turned and walked out of the warehouse without another word. The chill of the night air hit him like a slap to the face as Max stepped out into the empty street. The world seemed frozen in place, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next move. His thoughts raced as he walked toward his car, but there was no clear direction. Just the need to get away from Barron, to clear his head, and to figure out what to do next. His phone buzzed again. Max didn't even need to look at the screen to know it was Barron. "Barron, you're making a mistake. You can't escape." Max's fingers tightened around the phone. "I'm not running. I'm saving her." He ignored Barron's message and put the phone in his pocket. His hands were clammy, but there was a determination rising in him now. Rachel was counting on him, and he couldn't let her down. He couldn't save her by running. He couldn't save her by playing Barron's game. The only way to win was to take control of the situation. But how? What did Barron want from him? What was the real endgame? Max's mind snapped back to that one question he had yet to answer. What was Barron's true power? He reached his car, but before he could get in, his phone rang. He froze. This time, it wasn't Barron. Rachel. Max's breath caught in his throat. He answered quickly, his voice shaking. "Rachel? Rachel, where are you? Are you okay?" The line was silent for a moment, and Max's heart thundered in his chest. Then came the voice, faint but clear. "Max." Her voice cracked. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Max clenched his jaw. "Rachel, stay calm. I'm coming for you. I'll get you out of there." I don't know how much time we have," Rachel whispered. "Barron, he's everywhere. He's already planned everything. You're not the first person he's done this to, Max. You can't beat him. You can't." "Don't say that," Max interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm coming. I will find you. I will stop Barron, and I will get you out of there. Just hold on, Rachel." There was a soft sob on the other end of the line. "Please hurry." Max's hands trembled as he hung up the phone. The weight of her words pressed down on him. Barron had planned everything, and now Max was walking into the heart of whatever twisted scheme Barron had set in motion. But that didn't matter. What mattered was getting to Rachel, saving her, no matter the cost. Max's eyes burned with a mixture of fear and fury. He was done being pushed around. He was done being Barron's pawn. It was time to take back control. Max didn't waste a second. The clock was ticking, and he knew Barron wasn't going to show mercy. Rachel's voice still echoed in his mind, raw and fragile. "Please, hurry." He jumped into his car, the engine roaring to life beneath him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. His pulse was racing, and his thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Was Rachel still alive? Was she even in danger at all? Or was this just another part of Barron's twisted game to control him? No, Max told himself, I will save her. No matter what Barron says, no matter what it costs me. He pushed the accelerator to the floor, the tires screeching as he tore down the dark streets. He knew the warehouse Barron had used, the place where he had met with Max before, and he had a sinking feeling Rachel was there now. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't look at it. He couldn't afford distractions. Every second mattered. Every second might be the difference between Rachel's life and death. He slammed the brakes as he neared the outskirts of town. The streetlights were sparse here, casting long shadows across the desolate, industrial area. The abandoned buildings loomed like silent sentinels in the night, and Max knew exactly which one Barron would have chosen to hide Rachel in. The warehouse. Max parked his car in the shadows, out of sight, and cut the engine. He slipped out of the car, keeping low, his heart pounding in his chest. The night air was cold, and the silence felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. He crept toward the warehouse, moving quietly, staying hidden in the darkness. His mind was focused, but there was a voice deep inside him, a voice that whispered doubts. What if this is a trap? What if Barron is watching you right now, laughing at your desperation? Max pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford fear. He couldn't afford second-guessing. Rachel was depending on him, and that was all that mattered. The warehouse doors were slightly ajar, and Max slipped inside, his senses heightened. The air inside smelled of rust and decay, a stale mix of old machinery and musty wood. The space was vast, the darkness broken only by the faint flicker of a single, dim light at the far end of the room. Max's heart skipped a beat. He could hear faint voices, muted, but unmistakable. His instinct screamed at him to move fast, to get to Rachel before it was too late. He crept closer to the sound, staying low to the ground. As he neared the source of the voices, he saw movement in the shadows. A group of men, their backs turned to him, clustered around something. Rachel. She was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her head hanging low, her hands bound tightly behind her back. Max's stomach dropped at the sight of her. Blood on her lip, dirt on her face, but her chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. Barron's voice cut through the silence. She's not going anywhere. Neither are you, Max. Max's pulse thundered in his ears. He froze, every muscle tense. Barron was here. He had to be. The men around Rachel turned, and Max saw them clearly for the first time. They were heavily armed, their faces hidden beneath masks. His mind raced. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more. But he couldn't back down now. He couldn't let Barron win. From the shadows, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the small knife he kept for protection. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He could take them one by one if he had to, but he needed to act quickly. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the light. Barron. Max's breath hitched. The man had an eerie calm about him, as though he'd been expecting Max to show up. He was flanked by 2 of his masked associates, but it was clear Barron was in charge. Max's eyes burned with anger. Barron was the puppet master, pulling all the strings, controlling everyone in this room like pieces on a chessboard. "You're too late, Max," Barron said, his voice smooth and calculating. "You should have stayed out of this." Max clenched his jaw, his gaze never leaving Barron. "I'm not leaving without her," he growled, his voice low but filled with resolve. Barron chuckled darkly, his hands slipping into his pockets. "You think you have any power here? You think you can just waltz in and take her? There are consequences to defying me, Max." Max took a step forward, the knife now gripped tightly in his hand. He knew this was it, the moment where everything changed. There was no going back now. "Let her go, Barron," Max said, his voice hard. "If you want to fight, fight me. But she's done. She's not part of your game anymore." Barron's eyes narrowed. "You don't get it, do you, Max? This is bigger than you. It's bigger than her. It's about control. It's about power." He stepped closer to Rachel, and Max's blood ran cold. "But if you want her so badly, then you'll have to take her from me." He made a sudden movement, and one of his men stepped forward, brandishing a gun. Max didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, ducking to avoid the first bullet that whizzed past his ear. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the warehouse, and Max's heart raced as he scrambled for cover behind a stack of crates. The men fired blindly, but Max was too fast, moving quickly in the shadows, using the environment to his advantage. He could hear Barron laughing in the background. "You're not getting out of this alive, Max." Max's pulse hammered in his chest. He wasn't afraid to die, but he wasn't going to let Barron get away with this. Not now. Not after everything. Max's eyes flicked toward Rachel, who was still tied to the chair, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. She needs me, he thought. I need to get to her. He darted out from behind the crates, sprinting toward Rachel. The men fired again, but Max was too fast. He reached her, his hands shaking as he cut through the ropes with the knife. The tension was unbearable. He had to be quick. Rachel's eyes were filled with a mix of relief and disbelief as she looked up at him. "Max, you came, you really came." "I'm not leaving you," he said, pulling her to her feet, supporting her weight as she staggered. "We're getting out of here. Now." But just as they turned to run, Barron stepped forward again, his voice cold and commanding. "You think you've won? You think you can just walk away?" Max turned, eyes blazing. "I'm done playing your game, Barron. You're finished." Max's grip on Rachel tightened as he pulled her to her feet. Her breath was shallow, her face pale, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes now. He could feel her trembling, but he couldn't let that slow him down. He couldn't stop, not now. Barron's voice echoed through the warehouse, sharp and taunting, as he stepped closer. "You think you can walk out of here? You think you can take her and just leave?" Max didn't flinch. He could hear the fury in Barron's words, the desperation, but it wasn't the same man who had controlled everything. Barron was losing his grip, and Max wasn't going to give him a chance to get it back. Max held Rachel close, his eyes flicking to the men who were still standing in the shadows, guns drawn. But this time, Max wasn't afraid. His pulse raced with purpose. There was no more running, no more hiding. Barron had pushed him too far. He turned to Rachel, his voice soft but urgent. "We need to go. Now." Rachel nodded, her eyes wide, but Max could feel her fear. He wasn't going to let Barron tear her apart any longer. He wasn't going to let Barron win. As they moved toward the door, Barron's voice rang out again, louder, more forceful this time. "You think you're walking out of here, Max? You think you can just take what you want and leave me powerless? You're wrong." Max didn't stop. He kept walking, Rachel in tow, every step heavier than the last, knowing the confrontation was inevitable. And then, Barron made his move. "Stop them!" Barron shouted, and before Max could react, the masked men lunged forward, blocking the exit. Max's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't go back. There was no turning around now. The men moved quickly, and Max had no choice but to react. He shoved Rachel behind him, standing between her and the men. The warehouse was dimly lit, but the chaos around them seemed to illuminate the weight of the situation. The flickering lights cast long shadows on the cracked floor. "You want to fight, Barron?" Max growled, his eyes never leaving the men advancing toward him. He was ready. He had to be. Barron stepped closer, a cold, calculating smile on his lips. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you're better than me?" Max's eyes were locked on Barron now. His grip on the knife tightened, fingers aching from the tension. He wouldn't back down. Not for Barron. Not for anyone. "I'm done being a pawn in your game," Max said, his voice low, every word measured. "This ends tonight." Barron's smile faded, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Max. You don't know how deep I've got my hands in everything." Max didn't need to hear more. He knew exactly who Barron was. A manipulator, a shadow in the background, pulling strings to make sure he stayed in control. But not anymore. With a sudden movement, Max lunged at the first man, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. The man stumbled backward, but Max didn't stop. The knife flashed in the dim light as he cut through the air, narrowly missing the second man's arm. He was fast. He was desperate. And he was fighting for Rachel's life. A third man came at him from the side, and Max pivoted just in time, knocking him to the ground with a swift punch to the jaw. His heart was thundering, but his focus was sharp. There was no room for hesitation. Behind him, Rachel stumbled, but Max kept his eyes fixed on the remaining two men. They were close now, but not close enough. Barron stepped back, watching the chaos unfold with a cold amusement. "You think you're a hero, Max? You think you can just win this?" Max didn't answer. His hands were shaking, but his movements were precise. The men were slowing down, hesitant, unsure. They'd underestimated him, just like Barron had. They didn't realize the fire that burned inside him, the unrelenting drive to protect the one person who meant everything to him. In a split second, Max made his move. He disarmed the first man with a swift kick to the chest, sending the gun flying across the floor. Then, with a well-placed strike, he dropped the second man to his knees. Barron was next. Max advanced, his eyes never leaving the man who had caused so much destruction in his life. This ends now. Barron didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, but Max could see something else there now, a crack in the facade. Barron was realizing that the power he once had over Max was slipping away. "I warned you," Barron said, his voice low, almost desperate. "You're playing with fire." Max raised the knife, his chest heaving, every nerve alive with tension. "I'm done being your puppet. I'm done being scared of you." The air between them crackled with tension. Barron's expression shifted, the cold smile vanishing, replaced by a flicker of something, fear. Barron had never been afraid of anyone, but now, standing in the face of someone who refused to be controlled, he was starting to realize his grip on the situation had slipped. Max was no longer the person he had been, the man who cowered in the shadows, the man who had let Barron pull the strings. Max was different now. He was stronger. He had something Barron could never understand, the will to fight for something bigger than himself. With one final, resolute movement, Max slammed the knife into the ground beside Barron, inches from his feet. The message was clear. Max was taking control. He wasn't going to kill him, but Barron was done. Max stepped back, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. "You're not in charge anymore." Barron's gaze was cold, but it lacked the venom it had held before. "This isn't over, Max," he said, his voice low and threatening. Max didn't respond. He turned to Rachel, who was still shaken but standing, her eyes filled with gratitude. She stepped toward him, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "It's over, Barron," Max said, his voice calm but unwavering. "You're finished." As Barron took a step back, retreating into the shadows, Max turned and led Rachel out of the warehouse. The sound of Barron's retreating footsteps echoed behind them, but Max didn't look back. The night air felt different as they walked out of the warehouse, leaving the past behind them. The city lights flickered in the distance, a sign of a new beginning, a fresh start. Rachel looked at Max, her voice soft. "I thought I'd lost you, Max. I thought I wouldn't see you again." Max smiled, his hand resting on hers. "I told you I'd never leave you. Not after everything." As they walked into the night, away from the chaos and the darkness, Max knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came next. With Rachel by his side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?